This is Larry White, and you're listening to the Matt Balaker podcast.
Today's guest is a banking and money scholar who has taught at NYU and George Mason University. He's authored several books, and he has received the Adam Smith Award and is currently a senior scholar at the Cato Institute for Monetary and Financial Alternatives. He's also a co-editor of Econ Journal Watch. Please join me in welcoming Larry White to the program. How are you doing, Larry?
Good, Matt. How are you?
I'm excited to have you. I think this past week, there's been one, maybe two bank failures. Inflation is teetering at call it a 43-year high-ish. And so, I could use some help. I could use some help sifting through what's real and what's nonsense. And I figure who better to have as a guest than you. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of banking and inflation, how did you get into this study of economics? Like what interested you about it at a young age?
Oh, when I was in college, I initially thought I wanted to go to law school, but I got more exposure to economics. And in particular, when I was in college, I got to hear a talk by Israel Kirzner, who was professor at NYU for a long time. And later, I got the great opportunity to work as his colleague. But I heard him give a talk and saw the audience kind of hanging on his every word while he's opining about his view of the economy. And I thought, well, that looks like a pretty nice gig. I could do that.
I like these young, dog-eared individuals hanging on my every word. So I guess, the world didn't need many more attorneys, but we could certainly use more good economists. So thank you for making that choice. And where did you grow up, Larry?
I grew up in the suburbs of Philadelphia on the New Jersey side, a town called Moorestown, New Jersey. If you're from New Jersey and you ask me where I'm from, I say exit 4.
So shout out to exit 4. And how often do you get back to New Jersey these days?
Every so often, at least once a year, I would say. But actually, next month I'm going to my 50th high school reunion.
And are you going to give a lecture there, or are you going to drink?
I have been asked if I will sign copies of my new book. So I get to play minor celebrity, yeah.
I think it's at least moderate celebrity, Larry. Don't sell yourself short. And please tell the hundreds of millions of people who are tuning in right now what your new book is.
I think it's over my shoulder here. It's called Better Money, Gold, Fiat, or Bitcoin. So it's a side-by-side compare and contrast among different monetary standards. The fiat system being the status quo, the kind of system we have today. Gold standard having a historical track record for more centuries, and a Bitcoin standard being a hypothetical possibility that some people are enthusiastic about.
So Bitcoin's sort of the new kid on the block.
They actually function.
So you're looking at how they function, and I think many people, or at least a good chunk of folks out there, have some familiarity with a gold standard, or at least the idea is it's a commodity-backed money. Yeah. So yes. In layman terms, Larry, how would you describe the gold standard?
A gold standard is where a certain mass of gold serves as the basic monetary unit. So prices are denominated sometimes in a different name, like a dollar or a pound or a franc, but those are all names for a certain amount of gold. And then ordinary money, most people don't carry around gold coins. They use paper money and they write checks, but those kinds of bank issued money are backed by gold. They're redeemable for gold. So the system is pinned down by this commodity anchor. Whereas by contrast, our system today, you take a $20 bill to the Federal Reserve and say, I'd like to redeem this, and they'll give you 2 tens. Yeah. Right? There's nothing underlying the money we've got. Nothing tangible anyway.
One way I try to remember it is the gold standard makes money an asset. The fiat standard essentially makes it a liability, or you're betting on the full faith and credit of the United States government. Is that
Yeah,
a
I
good
wouldn't
summary?
use those terms because gold is an asset, sure. Fiat money is actually an asset too. I mean, it's if you have some, you're wealthier than if you don't have it.
That's true, but it's valuable in that people will redeem it for goods and services. I mean, like in and itself, it has no inherent value. I mean, it's based largely on trust versus
That's right. It doesn't have any
an asset.
other
Yeah.
value besides being used as money. So if faith in its usefulness as money disappears, its value disappears. And you see that in countries that undergo hyperinflation. Whereas under a gold standard, if you don't like the money, you can redeem it for gold and make jewelry out of it or sell it to somebody else. It's got an intrinsic
other
value or
uses.
a commodity value.
So when was I guess for how long was America on the gold standard, Larry, and what changed?
De facto, the U.S. was on a gold standard from the late 1820s up to the Civil War. Then we took a break. Both governments, Union and Confederate, suspended the gold standard so that they could print more money to fight the war. Of course, the Union government won. They didn't go back on the gold standard until 1879, but they remained on gold between 1879 and 1914. When First World War breaks out, the U.S. doesn't officially go off the gold standard, but the rest of the world does. So it's not working the way it used to. So all the European combatant countries go off the gold standard. A lot of gold flows into the U.S. As a result.
So it sounds like wars are a big precursor to getting off a gold standard.
That's the common pattern, yeah. So if you look at episodes in other countries, in Great Britain, for example, they go off the gold standard during the Napoleonic Wars and eventually get back on. But yeah, so the First World War was the sort of the last act of this drama where nobody really went back on in any serious, sustained way. And the world economy kind of limps between the two wars on a mixture of half-baked monetary standards. And then after the Second World War, we get the Bretton Woods system.
Yeah, and can you share with our audience what is the Bretton Woods system?
So the Bretton Woods system was an attempt to recreate or recapture the benefits of a gold standard, which was fixed exchange rates among all the major trading countries, and the whole system constrained by the quantity of money, constrained by the obligation of the U.S. Treasury to redeem U.S. dollars for gold at $35 an ounce. And that lasted until 1971 when Nixon finally shut the gold window. Although during that period, U.S. citizens were not allowed to own gold coins. So the gold standard was kind of suspended domestically, but observed internationally.
So you were not allowed to, what was the intuition behind that, being not allowed to own gold coins?
The federal government wanted the Fed to have all the gold so that they could issue more money based on the gold. So all citizens had to turn in their gold coins. I'm not sure everybody did. It was hard to enforce. But all the banks had to turn in their gold reserves to the Fed. And so now the Fed had more gold reserves and it could print more dollars. And it actually took them a while to take advantage of that opportunity, but they did in spades starting in the 1960s. So under Bretton Woods, inflation was low during the 50s, but it started to rise during the 60s. And eventually the US printed more dollars than was consistent with continuing to redeem them at $35 an ounce. And that's when Nixon gave it up.
So they're saying this is too hard to maintain, the hell with it. I mean, to play devil's advocate, Larry, what are some reasons to get off a gold standard and move towards fiat currency?
So the comic writer Dave Barry, I think, had the best explanation. He said,
may he rest
all the
in
governments
peace.
in the world, having discovered that gold was hard to come by, decided to back their money by something that was easier to come by, namely nothing. So the gold standard was a constraint on the ability to print money, and it was a binding constraint, and governments that wanted to print more money than the gold standard allowed them to got rid of the gold standard. That's
Thank you. And
short
sorry,
version of the story.
Errors and omissions. I confused him for PJ O'Rourke, who passed away now. So my apologies, Barry. So that's a good point. You know, gold is very limited. Fiat is pretty much unlimited. For everyday people, who cares? Like, how does this impact us, Larry?
Well, it impacts us because when governments print fiat money with abandon, we get high inflation, and that makes life difficult. It's enough of a problem when inflation is 7, 8, 9% like we had last year in the U.S. In Europe, they had 10%, but in other countries, you get 30, 50, 100% inflation in some of the worst cases, and that just makes the economy a complete chaos. All your price information becomes obsolete every day, and you have to start from scratch.
I mean, we've heard stories. I know former Russia, I think Zimbabwe, much of South America, of hyperinflation.
Venezuela, yeah.
Venezuela, yeah. Well, what are some examples that you think are of particular importance that people should know more about, Larry?
Well, right now, the sort of champions at high inflation are Venezuela, Zimbabwe, and Lebanon.
Lebanon, okay.
And Lebanon is a case where it's the fiscal side of it that has really wrecked the economy. It's the inability to keep spending to the level of tax revenue and trying to finance the difference by borrowing money and printing money. And the Lebanese pound has gone from 1,500 per US dollar to 90,000 per US dollar last time I looked.
Wow. And over the last few years, or over the last couple, inflation has become much more of a talked about phenomenon. And I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about it. I'm sure no expert, but in basic terms, it just means it takes more money to buy stuff.
It takes more money because there is more money in circulation. So it's more dollars chasing each bundle of goods. Or think of it another way. If you think of the supply of money as like a jug of milk, and you pour water into the jug, you got more liquid, but it doesn't buy anymore. It just takes more ounces to get the same nutritional value. So we dilute the purchasing power of the dollar when we keep adding dollars to the economy faster than the amount of goods to be bought is growing.
I like that example because I've thought of it as like if you just multiplied everything by 10, you'd still be equally wealthy, but we'd have many more millionaires.
Yeah, I like to use that thought experiment to explain why printing money doesn't make us wealthier. It just reduces the value of each unit of money.
That's true. And although we might feel cooler if we have 7 figures in the bank or 6 figures. So there's that. And
Actually, it becomes a real nuisance when every price tag has 7 zeros after it.
If you need scientific notation to buy toothpaste, something's wrong.
Often governments with that many zeros on their currency have what they call a reform, which just involves lopping off zeros. Right? But it off price tags and off all the currency notes and off all the bank accounts. There's a new peso that's worth 1,000 old pesos or 10,000 old pesos. It doesn't change anything real.
Right.
Just makes it a little easier to add and subtract.
So if inflation is essentially a rise in prices overall, not comparative prices, but
right,
more or less everything costs more. I've heard this argument, and I'd like you to tear it apart or agree with it. Why don't corporations just lower their prices? Why don't businesses just lower their prices to combat inflation, Larry?
Well, it would be feasible if they would all act in unison and the money supply would shrink at the same time. But absent that, any one business that lowers its prices is just lowering its prices relative to everybody else and thereby lowering its income, making itself worse off. So you can't expect everybody to volunteer to do that. And it's not necessary to do that to lower inflation. All that's necessary is for the central bank to be more prudent when governing the money supply.
Yeah. So hypothetically, if we had a fixed amount of money, say, make it easy, $100, and let's assume the population just stays the same, or you could increase the money supply to mirror the population growth.
All right.
Would we have inflation?
Well, what really matters is how much the supply of goods is growing. But if that's growing at the same rate as the money supply and the population, then no, we won't have inflation. We'll have, as many goods can be purchased with a dollar as before.
And, you and I are talking to each other, via computer. And I remember in the 80s and 90s, gosh, what the machine I had would have nowhere near the computing power that this does. And this is less, even on just nominal terms. It probably costs less than, a 1989 Mac.
Every time I shop for a laptop, I'm amazed. This is cheaper than the last one and much better.
Our phones have more computing power. So, entrepreneurship and technology has deflationary pressure, right? When
not always that dramatic, but yes. If you got a growing supply of goods, if it's growing faster than this quantity of money, then you'll get lower nominal prices, lower dollar prices. And that kind of describes the late 19th century when the output of goods is growing rapidly. The supply of money is growing, but not that rapidly. And so prices are falling and people are enjoying a higher standard of living, not so much through getting raises, but through everything getting cheaper.
Mm-hmm. Well, I learned a lot about economics watching the Phil Donahue show when I was sick as a kid. And I remember, I think that's when he had those interviews with Milton Friedman. And I've since seen some on YouTube, and they're great. I strongly recommend people check them out. But one clip, and I think it was Friedman that said it, is inflation is always a fiscal phenomenon. If we're
monetary.
Oh, okay. See, I should have watched Phil Donahue more. What did he mean by that?
Well, anytime historically where you see a sustained increase in the price level over time, so not a one-shot event, but a rising price level, and especially if it's a substantial increase in the price level, it's a high rate of inflation. It's, I think, always and everywhere is maybe a slight exaggeration, but it's pretty close to always and everywhere of a monetary phenomenon, meaning it's driven by rapid expansion in the quantity of money.
Okay.
Now, logically, there are two other possibilities. It could be shrinkage in the supply of goods, but we just never or rarely see the supply of goods shrinking at 10% a year, year after year. That's what it would have to do to give you 10% inflation year after year.
Okay.
But it's easy for the money supply to grow at that rate if the central bank wanted to. And then the other possibility is the amount of money people want to hold keeps shrinking relative to their spending, keeps shrinking year after year. This is the so-called velocity of money rising year after year. That's a logical possibility, but we don't see that either. So historically, every time you see a substantial inflation, it's driven by monetary expansion.
I just thought MV equals PY, and I don't think that's come to my head in 20 years.
Technical, but
yeah, so
exactly.
I was like, I remember an equation. Well, I want to.
It's M that varies a lot, and that explains the variation in P. V and Y don't vary so much.
So M is the money supply.
Right.
I guess one scenario I want to throw out and get your thoughts on. You just said inflation is a monetary phenomenon. If we're in a system, I'm going to say America because most of our listeners are American. We have 1 year where we bring in, call it $1 trillion in tax revenue, but we spend $2 trillion. We're running a deficit, and we don't sell assets. We don't do anything to finance this deficit other than take on more debt.
Right.
So in order to take on more debt, the more currency is essentially printed. We're boosting the money supply. I mean, isn't that
there's an intermediate step.
Okay.
We can take on more debt without boosting the money supply just by the Treasury borrowing more from the rest of the world, issuing more Treasury bonds. It only expands the money supply if the Federal Reserve decides to buy some of those bonds.
Gotcha.
Because they're swapping new money for bonds when they buy bonds.
So the bond buying program. So is that when I guess how would you categorize quantitative easing? Because I've heard it uses that, like the Fed buying bonds to effectively lower the supply of money in circulation.
Yeah, sorry. The Fed is buying bonds and increasing the quantity of money in circulation because they're replacing the bonds with Federal Reserve notes and bank reserves. So when the Fed buys bonds, it creates IOUs against itself. That's what it uses to buy the bonds. And now the banks and the public have more Federal Reserve notes, or in the case of banks, they have more bank reserves on the books of the Federal Reserve System. So the banks are then in a position to make more loans if they want to. There's a complication, which is that the Fed has a way to discourage the banks from creating loans and deposits, and that is to pay them interest on the reserves.
Mm-hmm.
And so we didn't get as much expansion in money held by the public as we got in the Federal Reserve's monetary liabilities, the so-called monetary base. In the financial crisis, that's when quantitative easing begins. We get a big expansion in the Fed's balance sheet. We don't get so much expansion in the public's holding of money. But in the pandemic in 2020, the Fed expands the monetary base and they don't discourage banks from lending it out. And we get a big increase in money held by the public, which was okay because the public wanted to hold more money. They didn't have much to spend it on in the early days of the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
But as the economy started returning to normal and people started spending off these accumulated money balances, the Fed would have to have withdrawn that money to prevent inflation, and they failed to do that.
Okay. Well, what's your take?
They're tightening now, but belatedly.
So, well, first off, thank you for correcting my. Yeah, it was the bond buying program that essentially like floated the stock markets from, call it, 2014 on.
Yeah.
And a lot of people like that. You know, I mean, a lot of people thought, okay, this is worthwhile intervention. We're not letting
they used
capitalism
to call it the
run amok.
Greenspan put.
The Greenspan put.
Right. If stock prices start to go down, Greenspan will loosen money enough, lower interest rates, and that'll boost stock prices back up again. And then it became the Bernanke put, and now it's the Powell put.
Well, if you do that, Larry, you can get paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to speak at Goldman Sachs conferences. So there are benefits to those puts. But I mean,
I give Ben Bernanke credit for not going to Wall Street after his term as governor of the Fed.
What do you think is a realistic and valuable use of the Fed? Like, what would you like to see the Fed do or not do?
Well, if I had my druthers, we'd have a different monetary regime in which we don't need a Fed.
Mm-hmm.
We don't need a currency monopoly. We don't need a government agency to bail out banks and other financial institutions. We don't need a government agency to regulate banks in ways that are counterproductive to the health of the banking system and to the deals that consumers get.
Mm-hmm.
But given the Fed that we have, and there are various options for trying to get the Fed to do less damage, constraining the Fed's discretion so that it's more predictable and less, improvisational. Because right now they're making it up as they go along, right? They just had a meeting and people are guessing what the new interest rate target is going to be and how long it's going to last. And a lot of decisions in financial markets hang on these decisions that the Fed makes, which is not a healthy kind of a system. It ought to be more predictable than that.
Yeah, I think guesswork with the Fed is probably not what you want. But, recently, in fact, right now, it looks like First Republic Bank is going under. Silicon Valley Bank filed bankruptcy recently. 2008, there was kind of the first, we'll call it modern banking crisis, at least that I remember. And I've heard people, on social media or just out there saying, this is why we need more banking regulation. This is why, we need entities, like the Fed. What is your response to that, Larry?
The problems we had are mostly the result of banking regulation. So in the US, we've had, for a long time, we had restrictions against branch banking, which banks couldn't branch across state lines. And in some states, they couldn't even have more than one office. And so as a result, we had, close to 30,000 distinct banks in the United States. Since the 1990s, we have interstate branch banking, but we're still living with this legacy, and we're working down the number of banks gradually through mergers. But if you look at other rich economies, they don't have nearly so many banks per capita or per dollar of GDP. Canada is a good example, and they have stronger banking systems. In the US, in order to protect the small, weak banks, we created deposit insurance. We were the first country in the world to have national deposit insurance. And that's, weakened our banking system by making depositors not care about the strength of their bank. So people just shop around for the highest rates and don't do any diligence. At least the insured depositors don't.
Mm-hmm.
But we have been relying on the uninsured depositors, and there's about half of all the deposits are uninsured. I mean, that's surprising, but a lot of corporations have bank accounts that are way above the $250,000 limit. And they do shop around for a safe bank, at least they're supposed to. Mm-hmm. And that's been an important force in disciplining banks. But the Silicon Valley Bank failure was a case in which the uninsured depositors were apparently not paying attention to how badly run the bank was. And when they belatedly woke up to the fact that the bank was insolvent, then you had a run on the bank, which we're not supposed to have anymore.
No one likes runs on the bank, but I want to dive a little bit deeper there on a point you just made. Is it really the responsibility, or should it be the responsibility, in your opinion, of depositors to effectively do due diligence on the bank? I mean, is that too much?
Yes, because the alternative is relying on regulators to look out for you. And we've discovered that they're not very good at that. They were not on top of the problems at Silicon Valley Bank or Republic National Bank, right? They've been very slow to recognize, at least somewhere in the system, maybe the supervisors reported it to their bosses and their bosses sat on it. Somewhere, the message didn't get through that these banks are insolvent and need to be closed. And when a bank is already insolvent, so it's been squandering resources, it's been taking, $100 in depositor funds and turning it into $98 in assets, mm-hmm. That bank ought to be closed. And if the regulators won't close it, then, well, at least the bank run closes it. So there is something actually beneficial about a bank run if the regulators are asleep at the switch. It gets the bank closed. Now, it's kind of messy, which is unfortunate. Right? It's first come, first serve. Mm-hmm. So it makes keeping your deposit there risky. But that means that you do have to pay attention. And so it does have this incentive effect that you can't just rely on everybody else. You've got to do your own diligence.
Right.
And people do that when they put money in a mutual fund or when they choose a pension. So I don't think it's too much to ask. But
there's a reason Vanguard's been around for as long as it has, or PIMCO.
If you do think it's too much to ask of ordinary households, then okay, we could have deposit insurance up to, let's say, $10,000. And if you have more than $10,000, buy a treasury bond. Mm-hmm. Right now you can afford a treasury bond, and that's perfectly safe. It's the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. It's safe against default. There's no guarantee that the value won't be inflated away.
Sure.
But at least it's safe against default, like an insured bank deposit. And that would, allow the professionals, the businesses that have bank accounts above that amount, to do the job of shopping around for a safe bank. I don't think it's too much to ask a corporation that has more than $250,000 in a bank account today to hire somebody to check out whether the bank is good for it.
Oh yeah,
that seems to me okay to ask them that of them.
There's Moody's and there's other credit rating agencies.
There are bank rating agencies too.
The infrastructure is already there. So,
but let me tell you a story. There, one of the sort of hidden stories in Silicon Valley Bank is that they were a crypto-friendly bank, mm-hmm. and people in the crypto business are convinced that that's why they were allowed to fail. And in the same weekend, the authorities closed Signature Bank, which it's not clear was even in trouble. So SVB was insolvent. That's pretty clear. Not clear that Signature was insolvent. Barney Frank of the Dodd-Frank Act was a member of the board of directors of Signature Bank, and he's been complaining. They closed us. They didn't have to. We weren't insolvent. And they were also a crypto-friendly bank. So there's some reason to be concerned about the power to close banks being, used for purposes of deciding who gets credit and who doesn't get credit. So that's a concern.
Yeah, I mean, I guess anytime a group has that much influence, there's cause for concern. And I'm certainly to say I'm not an expert when it comes to cryptocurrencies is an understatement. But one thing I've appreciated about it is it allows people not only in America but in developing countries, throughout the world, to transact, and they're less reliant on their sovereign monetary system, for lack of a better word. What for in lay terms, what are some of the benefits and risks, in your opinion, to cryptocurrencies?
So the beauty of Bitcoin and all the other cryptocurrencies that emulate it is that you can transfer money to people across the street or around the world on alternative payment rails. You don't have to go through your bank. You don't have to go through your central bank. Right? If you try to wire money to, let's say, a dissident group in Belarus, it's not going to get.
I might have to do that tomorrow. So yeah, please continue.
It's not going to get to them. Don't do it, because the Belarusian government won't allow them to have a bank account. They won't let payments go through to them. But you can send them Bitcoin, and they can actually make use of it. There's a local market where they can sell it for local currency and pay salaries and buy groceries or whatever they want to do with the money. So it provides a censorship-resistant system of payments, which is, a great contribution to the cause of liberty around the world. It preserves at least a little island or channel of financial privacy. Now,
and then what would be the counter to financial privacy? Like if there were I've heard of a digital currency issued by the U.S. of A. How does that make you feel? Something like that. Would you be in favor of it?
Yeah, so people are talking about a central bank digital currency, which would be a liability of the Federal Reserve System in the U.S. And the way I feel about that is kind of the way I feel about the U.S. Postal Service. It's a government monopoly that should have been eliminated a long time ago. If you didn't have a legal monopoly on first-class mail, other services, UPS or FedEx or somebody like that, would be delivering the mail much more cheaply and efficiently, just as they deliver packages.
Well, one thing that scares me about, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
And the idea of a government-backed digital currency is the ability to freeze and track transactions. I think just seems super creepy.
Yes.
We saw something in Canada, and God forbid a certain industry goes out of favor, or
right.
It's hard to explain, but at least with cash or Bitcoin, it can't just be frozen. There's that makes me really nervous. Am I being paranoid, or are my fears grounded?
No, I think your fears are grounded. So in Canada, they froze transfers to the striking truckers on the grounds that the truckers were breaking the noise law, or the ordinances against making too much noise.
I think some call them like domestic terrorists, or I don't know, so like.
But if you want the real dystopian case, look at China. They're introducing a central bank digital currency, which everybody's going to have to use, so that the government can surveil everybody's bank account and know where you're getting your money from and where you're spending it. And it's going to be linked to their social credit system, so that, if you bought too much alcohol, then we're going to ding you. We're going to reduce the number of social credit points you've got. And if you try to buy a train ticket to go to another city, we may block that transaction in order to teach you to be more responsible citizen. So yes, that's Big Brother. That's extremely creepy. So a central bank digital currency has that potential. And right now, we don't have as much banking privacy as you might think you have, or as you might like to have, because if the FBI or the drug enforcement people or ICE go to your bank and say, we'd like to look at your bank account, the bank could say, no, you're going to have to get a court order. But usually the bank says, okay, because they're regulated. They don't want to anger their regulators. But if it's all on the books of the Federal Reserve System, there isn't even sort of that need to get an approval to look at your bank account. It's right there. And the Fed is not going to fight other branches of the federal government before giving up that information just on the slightest kind of suspicion. So I think we need more, protection against unwarranted search and seizure of people's financial records.
So the Fourth Amendment applying to financial records in a sense. What are some?
Yeah, now under the Bank Secrecy Act, they have this ridiculous doctrine that, well, since you provided this information to the bank, you don't have any reasonable expectation of privacy. So the government taking it from the bank, no big deal.
Wow. I mean, what curbs could we have on this? Like, what would be some? Is crypto the way?
Search warrant. That seems to me to be a reasonable step.
I mean, that would require some guts too by the banking institutions. I mean, but when you're being bailed out by the feds, what motivation do you have to fight
banks
them?
Don't want to stick their necks out on this. It would take Congress to revise the Bank Secrecy Act and actually make it a secrecy protection act instead of a secrecy violating act.
I mean, if Larry, if cryptos become more ubiquitous, I mean, isn't that kind of stealing some of the thunder from the feds? I mean, is that a curb on potential power abuse?
Yeah, it could be. Now, right now, and I discussed this in the book, the leading crypto, of course, is Bitcoin. But Bitcoin is designed in such a way that the supply is very inflexible. There's a fixed number of Bitcoin at any point in time, no matter what happens to the value of Bitcoin. So if more people want Bitcoin, the price shoots up. There's no increase in the quantity to satisfy that demand, just the price goes up. And that means the price of Bitcoin is very volatile. And I contrast that with a gold standard where you do get some more gold when there's an increase in the value of gold. And so that makes it inconvenient to use Bitcoin for everyday transactions. I mean, it goes up 7% in a day, goes down 10% the next day. You don't want to keep your rent money in Bitcoin. But it does play an important role to the extent that people use it to avoid censorship. And there are other kinds of cryptocurrency. There are the so-called stable coins that are they're valued in US dollars. They have a fixed price in US dollars. So they're a safer way from the point of view of knowing how much money is in your account. And people are using them now to make international payments, buy goods and services, pay wages, and so on.
Do you think there's a risk of currency confusion or just having too many modes of transaction where
it's a self-limiting problem. You can always use the common currency if you want to. Nobody forces you to use anything exotic. But if you live in a country with really high inflation, you're happy to have a second alternative. And there it's really oppressive for governments to say, no, we're not going to let you use any alternative currencies. We're going to trap you in our own lousy currency because we want to tax you by making the money buy less and less.
Right.
So that's when it really becomes important to have this freedom.
And in a sense,
it's also important for privacy and escaping surveillance. So inside China, people will transact in Bitcoin. They have to be deep underground to do this, but in order to keep these transactions from being monitored, they do use crypto.
Wow. I remember a long time ago, or it was either me or a friend, I don't remember, but working for an RIA and dealing with some Chinese citizens who were they just want to get money out of there. Just
Right.
like by any account. And it's like they almost, not they don't care what happened with it, but it was so eye-opening. I mean, just to think like people just want to get their money the hell out of there
Well,
because
in Venezuela, it's played an important role too, because the government was shutting down dollar transfers. So people were trying to convert their savings into dollars and then transfer the dollars. But that pipeline was shut down by the government, but they weren't able to shut down buying Bitcoin and shipping that out as a way to get your wealth out of the country while you could.
right. I mean, do you think not that they won't try, but is it realistic, Larry, to think that governments can curb the use of cryptocurrencies to an extent where they're essentially worthless, or they're more of a novelty than actual currency?
They can certainly drive it underground. So the Chinese government has outlawed Bitcoin, and it's outlawed Bitcoin mining, and they haven't reduced its use or its mining to zero, but they have, suppressed it. The miners have moved out of China to elsewhere, and the people who are using Bitcoin inside China are breaking the law, and so they have to stay underground. Businesses can't advertise, "We accept Bitcoin." Nobody can advertise, "I'm willing to pay Bitcoin." So that keeps it from becoming a very commonly accepted medium of exchange. Making it illegal does that. So yeah, they can't get every last user, but they can suppress it pretty effectively.
Oh, that's discouraging. But I know some people listening, they'll say, well, Bitcoin, at least on the trading markets, crashed year over year. It was terrible. What does that say about cryptocurrencies in general, if anything, Larry?
Well, the price is very volatile. So for most years, if you bought Bitcoin early on, you're doing well. In the last 2 years, it's been a little rockier. There hasn't been a strong upward trend. In fact, it's still down compared to its lifetime peak. This year, it's up a little bit. It's recovered a bit from its lows of 2022, but it's volatile. It bounces around because the news keeps changing about which governments are going to allow it and which governments are going to try to ban it. And
right. I mean,
so it moves up and down based on this information.
I've thought of it, and I could be wrong, but gold, the value of gold goes up and down. But gold, that's for very different reasons than the value of gold as a medium of exchange or as a currency.
That's right.
People invest in something because there's expectations on relative price changes, and there's all sorts of risks and uncertainties. Right. So something could be, like the value of Tesla shouldn't impact the value of automobiles in America. I mean, they're very, very, very different things, but I think they're kind of being lumped together. That's my little soapbox rant for the day.
Yeah, so people move in and out of crypto as an inflation hedge, and they move in and out of gold as an inflation hedge. Mm-hmm. And for that reason, some people have called Bitcoin digital gold. But besides that similarity, they're very different. They're very different in the way they're supplied. So as I emphasize in the book, Bitcoin has this fixed release schedule, and it's going to max out at 21 million Bitcoin. We're currently between 19 and 20, whereas gold keeps flowing out of the ground at a slow, pretty steady rate. Mm-hmm. But when the value is high, it comes out at a faster rate, and that helps bring the value back down. And when the value is low, it slows to a trickle, and that helps bring the value back up. So that makes it a little more desirable as, a place to keep your rent money as a commonly accepted medium of exchange.
Interesting. So when you're writing this book, Larry, what surprised you the most? What's something that you're like, oh, I didn't know that?
Well, I dug into the history of how Bitcoin emerged, and I discovered some, wrinkles that I hadn't been aware of. One of the surprising things is it turned out that I had been in touch, without knowing it at the time, with some of the people who were the pioneers of Bitcoin, in particular, a guy named Hal Finney, who is probably the leading candidate to be Satoshi Nakamoto, the pseudonymous creator of Bitcoin. So he had written a piece in this obscure libertarian magazine, and I had written a piece in response to it called something like Thoughts on the Economics of Digital Currency. And then he responded to me. And I was in touch with a guy named Nick Szabo, who was the creator of a precursor to Bitcoin called BitGold. So these people were on the forefront of the cryptography revolution. I really didn't know anything about that, but I knew something about the economics of money. So that surprised me. I was
My
of
son
mixing
says
with these
hi.
people without really realizing what they were up to. I wish I had, been more aware and gotten in earlier on Bitcoin
So
investing.
you were part of the Bitcoin underground and didn't know it.
That's right. The cypherpunk underground.
The cypherpunk, that sounds so badass, Larry. I wish I was part of the cypherpunk underground. What are some important lessons? I mean, people got to buy the book, but after they read it, what do you hope the impact is on your book?
Well, that people will be aware of what the alternatives to our current monetary regime are. They'll appreciate the differences between a gold standard and a Bitcoin standard, and they'll have a clear-eyed picture of how our current regime is failing us. And I spend a fair amount in the book on how the gold standard performed historically and how it can be allowed to run in the most efficient way, which is you don't need a central bank to operate it. It works better with decentralization and competition among issuers of gold-backed money. So I don't anticipate that the fiat money system is going to fall apart anytime soon, unless inflation just keeps going up.
Mm-hmm.
In which case, it will be good to have considered the alternatives in advance. So it's good to have Plan B on the shelf, even if we don't need it right now, if the day arrives when we do need it.
That's important. And do you have a favorite monetary system, Larry?
So I'm a fan of free banking on a gold standard. And by free banking, I mean no central bank, issue of bank deposits, and even paper currency is carried on by ordinary commercial banks on a competitive basis. And so the banks, in a way, discipline each other. No bank can overissue without it building up obligations to the other banks who will come calling for gold reserves. And when a bank sees its gold reserves flowing out, then they know they have to stop expanding.
Nice. Well, Larry, where can people buy this book?
It's on Amazon. It's available in hardback, paperback, and Kindle.
We'll definitely
or you can go direct to Cambridge University Press.
We'll go to direct to, and we'll put a link to it in the description of this episode. But before we wrap up, Larry, what are you most optimistic about when it comes to banking, the economy in general, progress? What excites you?
Well, young people getting excited about cryptocurrency, I think, is an important entryway to them becoming more aware of the drawbacks of our current system. So I remember the day, let's say before Bitcoin, so let's say 20 years ago, when nobody even knew the term fiat money. The only people who used the term fiat money were gold bugs. Mm-hmm. And now there's a whole generation of people who understand the distinction between fiat money, commodity money, and cryptocurrency, and they use those terms correctly, and they're aware that the system we've got is not the only possibility, and that the separation of money and state is a possibility. And some of them are taking steps to put themselves on an alternative standard. So that's what makes me optimistic, even if I think that ultimately gold will prove more popular than Bitcoin, at least as a everyday medium of exchange.
Well, now I'm more optimistic. So
let me just add the technology that Bitcoin introduced, the so-called blockchain technology, has been adapted by people issuing gold-denominated currencies and deposits. So it's getting cheaper to transact and transfer gold from peer to peer the same way you can transfer cryptocurrency.
Good to know. So Larry, after people buy your book, where can they learn more about you, your work, what you're up to?
They can Google me, Lawrence H. White, and I have a page maintained by the Cato Institute where, as you mentioned, I'm a senior fellow of the Center for Financial and Monetary Alternatives, and they sort of have links to, recent papers and podcasts and interviews I've done.
Wonderful. Well, Larry, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Matt. It's been good.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Matt Balaker podcast. To learn more, please check out mattbalaker.com and encourage your friends to like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate it.